Say that that tunnel was fully engineered and equipped with electricity, lighting, and ventilation. Authorities believe that that tunnel could have been used by criminal organizations to smuggle large amounts of drugs into the United States.
Tensions flared in the sweltering heat of southern Texas as federal authorities moved swiftly and unexpectedly to shut down a critical stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border. The decision came in the wake of a harrowing discovery beneath the sun-baked terrain, hidden from plain view, but threatening enough to trigger one of the most abrupt and wide-reaching security crackdowns in recent years. The shutdown wasn't just another political tug-of-war between state and federal powers over immigration or drug enforcement. It was the result of something far more chilling, buried deep beneath the dusty landscape. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. For weeks, Border Patrol agents and specialized surveillance teams had been monitoring subtle anomalies in ground sensor data along a relatively quiet section of the Rio Grande near Laredo. At first, officials suspected ordinary tunnel activity, something the Department of Homeland Security had seen before, used by cartels to move narcotics and people under the border with shocking efficiency. But what they ultimately found went beyond anything previously encountered. The underground passage was not only longer and deeper than any known smuggling tunnel, but it led to a vast network, an intricately built system of caverns and corridors stretching miles beneath both sides of the border. The construction was too advanced for simple drug trafficking operations. Reinforced with steel beams and outfitted with rudimentary but functional ventilation and lighting systems, the tunnel's scale raised serious questions. It appeared to have taken years to construct, and investigators quickly ruled out any local criminal organizations as the sole engineers. Something larger was at play. Something organized, secretive, and highly resourceful. The discovery sent shockwaves through federal agencies, triggering a high-level response that included the Department of Defense, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security. Within hours of confirming the scope of the tunnel system, federal authorities moved to shut down all border crossings within a 50-mile radius of the site. No exceptions were made. The move effectively sealed off this stretch of Texas, grounding commercial activity, halting legal immigration processes, and even separating families caught in the middle of routine cross-border visits. Residents on both sides of the Rio Grande were blindsided. Local officials were left scrambling for answers, their phone lines jammed with panicked calls from constituents. But the federal government remained tight-lipped, refusing to release detailed information about what exactly had been found underground. Unofficial leaks, however, painted a far more disturbing picture than the public announcements. Sources close to the investigation reported that the underground network may have included hidden chambers stocked with weapons, communications equipment, and even evidence of long-term habitation. This was no mere tunnel for smuggling. It looked like a forward operating base, strategically positioned, meticulously constructed, and possibly part of a broader, more coordinated effort that had somehow gone undetected for years. Satellite imagery later revealed that the tunnel entrances and exits were expertly camouflaged within existing structures and natural terrain, making aerial detection virtually impossible. What truly terrified authorities wasn't just the physical presence of this subterranean network. It was the implication that something of this scale had been operating entirely in the shadows, right beneath the feet of law enforcement. If a clandestine system of this complexity could be built without detection, what else might exist undetected? The prospect of similar underground networks scattered across the border suddenly seemed not only plausible but probable. That realization shattered the fragile sense of control that federal agencies had long maintained over border security. The implications reverberated throughout Washington as lawmakers were briefed behind closed doors. Intelligence analysts worked overtime to determine the origin of the tunnel system and who might be behind it. Theories ranged from Mexican cartels to foreign state actors to rogue militias operating under a radicalized ideology. Each possibility carried its own geopolitical risks. If cartels were involved, it would represent a dangerous escalation in their operational capabilities. If a foreign power was implicated, the matter could explode into an international incident. And if domestic actors were behind it, it would signal a new and deeply troubling evolution in domestic extremism. Back in Texas, the shutdown strained local infrastructure and communities. The border region, a zone of deep economic and cultural interdependence, found itself abruptly severed. Trucking routes were disrupted, agricultural goods rotted in the sun, and cross-border workers were unable to reach their jobs. Medical patients missed critical treatments, and students were trapped on one side of the border from their schools. While the underground threat was treated with utmost seriousness, the collateral damage of the shutdown was immediate and far-reaching. In the absence of clear answers, speculation filled the void. Local residents began circulating videos of increased military presence: black SUVs, armored vehicles, low-flying drones. Some claimed to hear sounds coming from beneath the ground at night: low rumbling vibrations, metallic clanks, and what one rancher described as drills echoing through the earth. Others reported seeing strange figures near abandoned properties just days before the shutdown, dressed in desert camouflage with no visible insignia. The combination of official silence and community paranoia turned the region into a pressure cooker of fear and rumor. At the heart of the mystery lay the question of who had orchestrated the construction of the underground network. Analysis of the materials found within the tunnel, reinforced steel, imported electrical components, and specialized digging equipment suggested a sophisticated supply chain. None of the items appeared locally sourced. Even more unsettling was the forensic evidence indicating human activity over an extended period. Fingerprints, traces of meals, discarded clothing, and perhaps most haunting, child-sized footprints. That last detail prompted an immediate child trafficking task force deployment to the site. Federal response teams also discovered encrypted communication devices buried within the structure. While attempts to decode the messages were underway, early assessments suggested the use of foreign encryption protocols. This intensified speculation about outside involvement. Suddenly, the idea that this tunnel was a cartel operation seemed too simplistic. The level of stealth, planning, and resource mobilization indicated something far more ominous. Every agency involved now faced a critical dilemma: how much to reveal to the public? Releasing too little risked fueling conspiracy theories and eroding trust, while releasing too much could spark mass panic. Withholding details had already caused a surge in nationalist rhetoric, particularly in communities that viewed the shutdown as evidence of federal failure. Militia groups began mobilizing, patrolling border towns under the pretense of protecting their communities. The atmosphere grew tenser by the day. On the surface, the border looked calm, though deserted. Checkpoints stood empty, surrounded by hastily erected barriers and armed guards. The skies buzzed with surveillance drones. But beneath the calm lay a growing undercurrent of fear and confusion. The shutdown was more than a physical blockade. It was a symbolic rupture, a reminder of how vulnerable the border truly was. Despite billions spent on surveillance towers, drones, and fencing, a hidden threat had still wormed its way through, quietly undermining the entire system. The economic shockwaves rippled outward. Texas, heavily reliant on cross-border trade, saw its supply chains disrupted. Local economies cratered as goods stopped flowing. Restaurants and markets that relied on daily deliveries from Mexico found their shelves empty. Manufacturers missed production deadlines, and warehouses overflowed with unshipped inventory. The longer the shutdown persisted, the more it bled into the national economy. Meanwhile, public pressure mounted for a federal explanation, and state leaders demanded to be looped into the investigation. Governor-level communications with the White House reportedly grew heated. Texas officials, blindsided by the shutdown and excluded from initial briefings, demanded full transparency. Yet the federal government remained wary, especially as early evidence hinted at possible political volatility if the truth came out too quickly. The narrative was delicate. Any perceived mishandling could cascade into a full-blown crisis of confidence. Inside the tunnel network itself, teams worked round the clock, mapping every corridor and chamber. Robotic drones scanned the walls, floors, and ceilings for structural anomalies. They uncovered hidden compartments filled with maps, tools, and, most disturbingly, schematics of other possible tunnel locations. These diagrams included coordinates stretching far beyond Texas into Arizona, New Mexico, and even Southern California. If genuine, the find suggested a multi-state operation, likely still active. The shutdown, once considered an overreaction, now looked more like a first step in a broader defensive strategy. Even without a public explanation, whispers of what lay beneath the ground reached foreign ears. Intelligence chatter indicated that foreign governments had taken notice of the U.S. response, with some allies offering technical support and others quietly probing for more information. The U.S. border, long a domestic political battleground, had suddenly become a focal point in international security dialogue. In Texas, residents adapted to the new normal. Makeshift markets sprang up on both sides of the closed border, where people bartered for essentials. Families communicated through phone calls and video chats rather than weekend visits. Trust in federal agencies eroded further as the blackout on information continued. Yet there was also a grim sense of unity as communities worked together to navigate the uncertainty. Meanwhile, federal authorities deepened their investigation into what they were now calling a Tier 1 cross-border subterranean threat. The label hinted at national security implications beyond ordinary criminal enterprise. More disturbing clues emerged daily. Remnants of uniforms with no known affiliation, biometric data that didn't match any U.S. database, and soil samples suggesting the excavation had begun over a decade ago. The story wasn't just about what was found, it was about how long it had remained hidden and what else might still be buried. As the investigation stretched on, new questions arose. Had anyone attempted to alert authorities in the past, only to be ignored? Had unexplained disappearances in the region been connected to the tunnel network? Were some local officials compromised, or simply unaware? The tunnel had become a nexus of suspicion, its cold, dark corridors a metaphor for the blind spots in the nation's border enforcement. The shutdown itself began to feel like a tourniquet, painful but necessary. Every day it remained in effect. Pressure mounted on federal agencies to produce not just answers but solutions. Could future threats be prevented, or had the U.S. already ceded too much ground to forces operating beneath it, literally and figuratively? The mystery of what lay beneath Texas had transformed from a regional oddity into a full-blown national security enigma. The shutdown of the border wasn't merely a response to what had been found, it was a reluctant acknowledgement of how much had been missed. For all the satellites, drones, and fences, it had taken an invisible network beneath the soil to expose the vulnerabilities of an entire system. And as the federal government scrambled to regain control, one truth remained inescapable. Something had been growing in the shadows for years, and now that it had been uncovered, nothing at the border would ever be the same again. The days following the Texas border shutdown were marked by a charged and uneasy silence. The Department of Homeland Security, along with several military and intelligence agencies, began expanding their zone of control, moving checkpoints further out from the original epicenter of the underground discovery. Each mile brought new logistical hurdles. With roads blocked, local and state law enforcement were kept at arm's length, a sign that the operation was moving into unprecedented territory, one where even state sovereignty was placed on pause in favor of federal containment. As operations intensified underground, an entirely separate team was mobilized above ground to conduct a full-scale sweep of properties and facilities within a 100-mile radius. These sweeps weren't just standard procedure. They were thorough inspections using ground-penetrating radar, magnetometers, and electromagnetic pulse mapping to detect even the faintest traces of structural anomalies beneath the surface. The need for secrecy persisted, but it grew harder to maintain. People began to notice the way entire neighborhoods were being cordoned off, how rural homes were suddenly surrounded by federal agents, and how farmers were being pushed off their own land, told only that it was a matter of national security. What wasn't being publicly acknowledged, but was being studied in secure labs and briefed to elite intelligence circles, was the chemical and biological evidence recovered from some of the tunnel's deeper chambers. Biological samples were sealed and flown to high-security bio-research facilities, raising alarms among those who knew of the sudden transport. The mere presence of such samples suggested that the tunnel had served not just as a physical passageway, but possibly as a containment facility or testing site. The signs pointed to something far more insidious than mere transport routes. A single misstep by a hazmat-clad technician inside the structure had triggered the lockdown of an entire response unit for 48 hours, enough to make decision-makers in Washington start quietly preparing contingency protocols. While the media was largely kept in the dark, seasoned investigative journalists picked up on breadcrumbs. Satellite images were scrutinized, showing excavation machinery moving into the region at night. Some theorized that the discovery had compromised not just national borders, but perhaps the very framework of border policy itself. The reality that an advanced underground network had grown undetected beneath multiple federal installations and military-adjacent facilities suggested either a level of incompetence too catastrophic to admit, or a deeper, more institutionalized neglect. Experts in underground warfare were called in. Individuals who had experience in tracking North Korean tunnels, Hezbollah subterranean systems, and even the Viet Cong networks from decades ago. Their initial assessments shocked U.S. officials. The complexity of the structure bore the hallmarks of military-grade engineering: strategic load-bearing design, dual-purpose corridors, emergency flood chambers, and sealed, pressurized doors. Whoever had designed this wasn't improvising. They had blueprints, tools, funding, and a timeline that spanned years. More telling was the realization that portions of the tunnel network had been deliberately collapsed before discovery. Those responsible for the construction had either anticipated being found or had planned an escape contingency from the beginning. Back in Washington, a parallel crisis emerged. Congressional leaders began demanding classified briefings. A bipartisan group of senators, alarmed by what little information they had received, pressed for transparency. The closed-door meetings became intense, with intelligence officers walking a fine line between disclosure and damage control. When confronted with maps showing the vast sprawl of the tunnels and accompanying logs indicating multiple underground departures and re-entries along the border, many lawmakers were left speechless. Some demanded immediate military reinforcement along the entire southern border. Others quietly prepared statements should the public demand accountability. As internal panic escalated, the intelligence community pushed forward with facial recognition sweeps and biometric tracing, hoping to identify those who had frequented the network. The results were murky. A significant percentage of matches came back unregistered in both domestic and international databases. These weren't just undocumented migrants or cartel foot soldiers, they were ghosts. No credit history, no criminal records, no country of origin. The absence of data was itself a red flag. Intelligence veterans suspected deep cover operations or isolated radical networks groomed off-grid for years. The involvement of sovereign actors with near-perfect operational secrecy was no longer off the table. Meanwhile, evidence recovered from the deeper vaults of the tunnel revealed symbols etched into concrete and metal, some appearing ritualistic, others resembling encryption keys or navigational markers. Cryptographers and cultural anthropologists were consulted to decode the symbols, but results were inconclusive. Some bore resemblance to Middle Eastern numerology systems. Others seemed like mathematical notations used in quantum physics or engineering diagrams. The combination was strange and disorienting. Why mix advanced math with archaic symbols? Was this a code system, a map, or a red herring meant to throw off investigators? The discovery of narrow alcoves sealed by metallic plates made the situation even more bizarre. When one such compartment was opened, a set of canisters was found, tightly packed in bio-sealed containers with internal temperature regulation. The contents were not disclosed, even to most of the response teams on site. The containers were removed under armed escort and transported by air to an undisclosed location, bypassing standard CDC and FEMA protocols. This only fueled further speculation. Was the tunnel part of a long-term biowarfare plan? A smuggling route for stolen research? Or a hidden lab designed for experimentation? To those watching from the outside, the border closure was becoming less about the shutdown itself and more about what was being shielded from public view. Activists and legal watchdogs raised concerns about due process, especially for the hundreds of individuals detained near the perimeter of the discovery zone. These people weren't charged, but they weren't released either. They were classified as temporary intelligence assets, a new designation created under emergency security legislation. Their only crime, it seemed, was proximity to the unknown. Inside the closed zone, psychological strain began to take its toll on personnel. More than one team had reported auditory hallucinations while underground. Subsonic humming, mechanical echoes, voices in languages they couldn't identify. At first dismissed as fatigue or equipment interference, these reports grew in consistency. One veteran soldier, a tunnel rat with experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, requested immediate reassignment after claiming the tunnel's acoustics were alive. These stories didn't make it into the reports, but they circulated among operatives like whispered folklore. Some joked nervously about the tunnel being cursed. Others took the warning seriously. Seismologists monitoring the area detected minor tremors not linked to natural fault lines or traditional construction activity. These tremors were rhythmic, almost mechanical, occurring at regular intervals deep beneath the surface. The possibility arose that the tunnel was not an isolated project, but one node in a larger, possibly still active subterranean system. If machinery was still operating deeper underground, then someone or something had survived the initial shutdown. The idea that unknown actors could still be moving beneath Texas became an operational nightmare. Surveillance efforts doubled, but the sheer depth of the structure made conventional tracking methods unreliable. Strategic analysts began re-evaluating national border policy through a new lens. The concept of territorial control had always been rooted in visible infrastructure: walls, gates, patrols. But this incident forced a paradigm shift. Subterranean sovereignty was now a reality. Just as nations invested in aerospace and cyber domains, the underground frontier became a new battleground. Pentagon officials quietly began commissioning studies on deep Earth threat detection systems, while defense contractors pitched multi-billion-dollar contracts for anti-tunnel warfare technologies. A subterranean arms race had begun. In parallel, financial analysts scoured global markets for any unusual movements that could be linked to the events in Texas. They noticed a pattern of offshore accounts with sudden influxes of cryptocurrency traced to shell corporations in countries known for cybercrime and black market engineering. The timing of these deposits, days before the shutdown, suggested foreknowledge. Someone had predicted or perhaps instigated the discovery. Worse, there were indications that technology used in the tunnel's construction, especially its electromagnetic shielding, had military-grade characteristics and could have only been sourced through illegal arms trades or state-level espionage. Even more alarming was the discovery of a mobile server unit buried within one of the tunnel's sealed sections. When booted up in a secure facility, it presented a login portal with layered firewalls requiring access credentials in an unfamiliar language interface. The encryption was so advanced that NSA cyber teams described it as non-human readable, not in the science fiction sense, but in the way that it had been designed with recursive obfuscation algorithms. Someone had created a system not just to protect data, but to ensure it could never be read by standard decryption tools. The code structure hinted at artificial intelligence involvement, though not necessarily mainstream models. It was raw, stripped down, and disturbingly efficient. The server's heat logs revealed it had been active just 72 hours before the tunnel's discovery. It had sent and received data packets using bounce-back protocols that traveled through a network of hijacked satellites, anonymized relays, and dead-end points. Tracing the origin was like chasing a ghost across space. It hinted at an intelligence system that was not only hidden but in motion, still learning, still reacting. That raised the question: had the shutdown only revealed a single outpost of a wider digital and physical network? As the implications mounted, international response became inevitable. NATO quietly convened emergency cyber defense task forces. U.S. allies, particularly those with their own vulnerable borders, began internal sweeps for similar subterranean anomalies. Canada increased surveillance on its southern perimeter. Mexico, initially cooperative, grew silent, likely grappling with its own realization that this network may have operated with unwitting domestic facilitation. The global security architecture had been cracked, not from the skies or sea, but from beneath the soil. For years, everyone had looked outward, scanning for threats from rival nations, cybercriminals, and rogue states. No one had thought to look down. The psychological impact of the Texas border shutdown began to creep beyond the confines of the restricted zone, infecting the national psyche like a slow, invisible current. Though the government remained tight-lipped, whispers became tidal waves across online forums, underground networks, encrypted social media groups, and even private message boards of former intelligence and military personnel. The event had moved from being a secretive security operation to a cultural phenomenon, an enigma driving every imaginable theory, and none of them comforting. One of the most jarring developments came not from within the cavernous tunnels of Texas, but from a secure laboratory thousands of miles away, where the biological samples recovered from the sealed underground compartments were being analyzed. The findings, kept under an almost impenetrable veil of classification, reportedly showed the presence of non-native microbial life forms, organisms not previously recorded in North American subterranean ecosystems. These microbes weren't merely unusual. Some were resistant to standard antibiotics, while others possessed biosignatures that hinted at gene editing or synthetic alteration. The implications were staggering. If artificially engineered organisms had been housed underground, the tunnel's purpose may not have been just about movement or concealment. It may have involved biological experimentation or weaponization. The federal agencies leading the investigation had to consider terrifying new possibilities. Could this have been a lab designed to produce stealth pathogens? Was someone conducting unauthorized biotechnological research outside the purview of global regulation? If so, were the experiments still ongoing elsewhere? As more of the tunnel was mapped, a clearer picture of its design began to emerge. It wasn't a linear passageway, it was labyrinthine, meandering in sharp angles, looping back upon itself, forming strange pentagonal and hexagonal paths that baffled structural engineers. Some areas of the tunnel didn't even seem functional: corridors with no entrance or exit, chambers filled with crushed stone, and vertical shafts that led to solid rock. It was as though parts of the network were intentionally designed to confuse, mislead, or protect something deeply hidden within its core. This strategic misdirection is a technique sometimes seen in classified bunkers, suggesting that the tunnel's creators weren't simply burrowers, they were strategists. One section of the tunnel led to a chamber unlike any other. Carved with almost surgical precision, it housed a cylindrical vault embedded into the rock, accessible only through a rotating steel aperture that required synchronized multi-layered security protocols, retina scan, pressure-sensitive tiles, and an acoustic signature. The security mechanisms were beyond anything seen in non-governmental infrastructure. Inside the vault was a trove of sealed data cores, disk-like modules of unknown make and material, unreadable by conventional systems. It didn't take long for the Defense Intelligence Agency to call in advanced computational theorists. Some speculated the data cores were part of a decentralized knowledge system, a kind of offline blockchain used to transfer encrypted information without risking digital interception. What knowledge these cores contained remained unknown, but if they were tied to the microbial findings or the structural schematics of other potential tunnel networks, then this underground installation could have been a repository for a long-term clandestine project, one potentially beyond national or even human boundaries. Inside the intelligence community, urgency gave way to alarm. While the public worried about the shutdown's economic fallout, leadership within the federal security apparatus debated whether the U.S. was facing an unconventional domestic insurgence, a foreign incursion, or something else entirely, something post-national and off-grid. Analysts struggled to establish a historical parallel. Unlike Cold War espionage, this threat was decentralized. It was infrastructural, biological, technological, and potentially ideological, all at once. As the surface investigation expanded, digital forensics teams began trawling the dark web for relevant chatter. That's when they discovered something chilling. Months before the shutdown, coded posts had appeared across multiple anonymous boards. These weren't threats in the traditional sense. They were mathematical riddles, architectural puzzles, and strange sequences of coordinates, some of which matched the location of the discovered tunnel system. The posts were signed off with a repeating symbol, two intersecting arcs wrapped around an inverted triangle. No known hacker group or paramilitary faction claimed ownership. The symbol was new, but it started appearing in physical graffiti in abandoned towns near the Texas-Mexico border within days of the shutdown. It was a mark, left as a signpost or warning, or perhaps a signal. In border towns evacuated during the initial emergency response, search teams came across journals and notebooks abandoned in haste. One, written in Spanish and partially in code, described an underground church that prayed in silence beneath the land. References were made to rituals conducted in complete darkness and to sermons that spoke of a return through the roots of the earth. It was dismissed at first as delusion or metaphor, but as more writings surfaced, a pattern emerged. There had been a community, perhaps dozens or more, who believed the underground was sacred, not criminal. Their practices were secret, their networks built on oral tradition, and their language dense with metaphors about rebirth, return, and inversion of the surface world. Who they were and whether they had anything to do with the tunnel's construction remained unresolved. But it revealed a psychological element that law enforcement wasn't prepared for. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was belief. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the Texas border shutdown? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.